where men, they don't so much need love, they want respect. Like if they had to choose between love and respect from their mate, from their wife or their girlfriend, they would choose respect. And men aren't really, love is whatever. Just respect me when I come home. I'm willing to die for you. If somebody broke in the house, I would die to protect you. Just respect me. And if men don't get respect, that's when problems come up. Women need love. They want to be loved and adored and everything else. Men, different. Interested in your take on that.
So I had a psychotherapist called Adam Lane Smith on my podcast, and he has dealt with attachment issues and depression from both men and women for decades. He's been a clinical worker. And he said that male depression gets treated like female depression. Men are made to feel loved and accepted when all they want to do is feel capable and powerful. And he used this example of the Blitz in World War II. So the Germans are coming over and they're bombing London. And before the war started, there were these psychiatric wards and they had patients in. These patients had been catatonic for years, totally comatose, unresponsive. And the nurses would come in, feed them, roll them over, clean the bedpan, wash them, leave them again. These men, mostly men, had been completely unresponsive. Then the Blitz starts. And bombs are being dropped. And one of the problems that you had was that a lot of the men had already been taken off to war. They were already working in jobs. A lot of the women were also working, nurses, or looking after kids down in bunkers and in the underground, trying to protect them from the bombs. So there were fires and there were injuries all over London. And there were ambulances and fire engines, and there was no one to drive them. These men, who had been catatonic for 5 years and a decade, got up,
rose to the challenge,
put their shoes on, went outside, and started driving fire engines and ambulances. These men that had been unresponsive for years and years and years.
Because they had purpose.
And that's what Adam said. Adam said that give a man a purpose and the ability to achieve it, and he will crawl over broken glass with a smile. And I think that feeling capable and powerful and competent and respected and admired is something that will get a man so far. You give a man those things and he'll deal with suffering until the ends of the earth. We're designed to do that. We're designed to suffer. We're designed to deal with that suffering, but it needs to be in service of something.
Yeah.
You know, the man that suffers and doesn't have competence, capability, purpose, respect, meaning, admiration, that's a man that's depressed. That's a man who is alone and struggling and may take his own life, or may become increasingly useless to the potential partner and society around him, or may become radicalized, you know, in one form or another. And a man who is able to do things well is useful to everybody around him. One of the problems that you have is because there is a very small but pretty vicious cohort of men who do bad things to other people and women especially. In the same way as you said, you know, 90% of CEOs are white men, therefore all white men are having it great.
Yeah.
You know, whatever it is, like 0.1% of men or 0.05% of men or something commit sexual violence acts, therefore all men are predators.
Right.
What you do is you smear all of masculinity with the example of its most egregious transgressors. The problem that you have there is, what baby have you thrown out with the bathwater?
Right.
If in order to make a society where a very small cohort of men is no longer going to misbehave, you have to make all men sedated and useless, what do you want? Like, what is it that you want? And this is a really interesting question. So going into my evolutionary psychology obsession at the moment, there's a dynamic called young male syndrome. And young male syndrome describes a society in which there is a large cohort of unmarried, childless men, usually young men. This happens sometimes if there has been selective breeding, if women or if parents for some reason have chosen to have more male than female sons. You're seeing this in Japan and China at the moment. Or it could be if there has recently been some sort of catastrophe which has affected women more than men. Perhaps it was a cold snap and women were able to fend off this sort of cold a little bit less effectively. And throughout history, when you have this preponderance of men, also another one would be what's called a gerontocracy, which is where polygynous relationships and mating is reserved only for the older men.
I see.
And the younger men would tend to have to go through a bunch of trials and tribulations and stuff. And it's until you get to 35 that you actually are allowed to mate. Well, it's the young men mate on the side in any case, but they resent the older men. Basically, you have a large number of men, young men. Now, when you get into a relationship as a man, your testosterone drops. When you have children, your testosterone drops again. What this means is it reduces risk-taking behavior amongst men, and this would make sense. Like, if you now have to provide for first a wife and then kids, don't try and jump off that cliff and see if you don't die. Because if you leave behind some kids that aren't going to be able to fend for themselves, that's not good for your genetic line, right? So men's risk-taking behavior goes down when they get into a relationship and have kids. Which means
testosterone goes down.
Yes. Yeah. Which means that if you don't have many married men or men with kids, you have a greater increase in risk-taking behavior and testosterone. Men who are between the ages of whatever, like 17 and 28, let's say, just going around causing havoc, pushing over granny, graffitiing walls, and sometimes creating populist uprisings. Right? You know, this is the classic like gang mentality situation. The problem that you have at the moment is we have the highest rates of sexlessness amongst young men, I think, ever in history. The number of men reporting no sex in the last year has tripled from 8% to 28%.
Wow.
From 2008 to 2018. Roll that clock forward the next 4 years through the pandemic. I honestly think if you see a man on the street between the ages of 18 and 30 and you pointed at him, there would be a 50% chance that he hasn't had sex in the last year. That's not good, right?
What's that? What's going to happen? What's the result of this?
So most theories would suggest that you would have increasing societal instability. You'd have three things. Individual happiness drops because no matter how much of a hardcore men going their own way, like red pillar you are, there is a good amount of evidence that suggests having a companion, having friends, having connections is correlated with every outcome you want. Happiness, lifespan, health span, longevity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So people individually are going to be less happy. Societally, it should be less stable because of this young male syndrome that we've spoken about. You have less reason to buy in. Yeah, if your missus isn't going to keep tabs on whether or not you're fucking up the local gardens at night or whatever with your friends because you're just like playing football or whatever it is that you decide to do. And then civilizationally, you've got birth rate problems. The one that we're talking about is the societal stuff. So we know that we've got increasing rates of sexlessness amongst young men. But we haven't seen this huge preponderance of incel killings. You know, that's not to say we haven't had none, like Elliot Rodgers and blah, blah, blah. Most of the killings that do happen are coming from disaffected young men. But given that we've got as yet unseen rates of sexlessness, where are all of the terrorist events? And my theory, which is the male sedation hypothesis, is that men are being sedated out of their status seeking and reproductive behavior through porn and video games. I think that they are getting a titrated dose, just a little trickle.
And medicated, didn't you?
Yes, medication as well is also happening. Yes.
I think I saw you put that up the other day.
Correct, yes. So that's from the newsletter. 2,000 hours a year. Men between the ages of 18 and 30 on average pay 2,000 hours a year of video games, and a good chunk of them, at least 50% of them, are doing it whilst on prescription meds or on weed. So young male syndrome, right? And this is a perfect example of what we were talking about earlier on. Let's say that there are two versions of the world. One in which the traditional young male syndrome of populist uprisings and dangerous men and stuff occurs, and the other one in which you've got my sedation hypothesis going on. Given the choice between the two, I would rather have men not be causing havoc and burning down buildings, but only by a little bit. Like, you have got an army of useless, sedated men who are not contributing to society. They're not working jobs. They're not innovating. They're not driving GDP. And every year that they continue to do the things that they're doing, playing video games whilst on weed, they become less and less of an attractive mate for the sort of partner that would drag them out of that in any case. So you have a choice here between men who are dangerous but competent or sedated but useless.
Yeah. Tough choices.
Fucking hard, man.
Yeah.
Like, do you want the risk of uprisings whilst if you do need them to do something, they're there to do it?
They're available.
Correct.
And
this is
prepared.
This is the problem. You know, this is Peterson's whole thing. Like, you'd rather be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. That you need to be able to have competence and danger that you voluntarily control, because a rabbit isn't by its nature good. It's simply weak.
Right. Yeah. That's a good point. It also reminds me, I've read that, years ago, college educated kids were 60-40 men to women. And now it's 70-30 is some of the stats. So women are being more educated. Men are I guess less of a byproduct of a higher education. And so, we flipped that script on that, and the intentions were good because, hey, have women been oppressed? Who knows? But there's a concerted effort to get more women educated, college educated, and now it's reversed. And now, I mean, it feels like, I don't know, is there an ebb and flow to everything, or are we going too far with some of it?
So when Title IX was introduced, which was to try and improve the number of female college graduates that you had, that was 50 years ago, and the percentage point gap was 13 percentage points, right, between men and women. The gap is now 15 percentage points in the other direction.
Right.
Nobody at all. And I spoke to Richard Reeves, who wrote a great book that everybody should check out called Of Boys and Men. He's looked at this. He's a policy wonk from Washington, D.C., also a fellow countryman of mine. And nobody thought that in 50 years, this trend would blast through parity and swing back the other way.
Right.
Nobody thought that this was going to happen at all. So, I mean, what do you do when you have ever increasing numbers of women that are going to college and university? Well,
I'm just considering it with your example too. So you get the less capable men who, that's an unrelated issue, it seems like. And now the women and less men going to college also. That's like men taking a big hit.
Oh, it's a ton of L's. It's L's everywhere for men at the moment. Structurally, the three main areas that Richard looked at was education, employment, and fatherhood. In employment, the male labor force participation has dropped by 0.1% per month, every month since 1950. 87% in 1950, down to 68% now. And by 2040, it's going to be 65%, which will be an all-time low. You have two men, three women for every two men completing a 4-year US college. No, in fact, it is 3 to 2 for every two men completing a 4-year US college degree. And, is it right that we should give everybody as many opportunities as possible? Yes, absolutely. Was it the case that women's access to education and employment had been restricted for a good amount of time? Yeah, it was. They didn't have the same level of opportunities. But the problem that you have is this ever increasing cohort of high-performing women are now competing for an ever decreasing cohort of ultra high-performing men. The stats on Tinder suggest that the bottom 80% of men compete for the bottom 20% of women, and the top 80% of women compete for the top 20% of men.
Right.
So the top 20% of men, if you do get yourself into that cohort, quite rightly are commitment averse because they've got just this wealth of options in front of them. So they use women because why not? Men are not going to say no to many, many women.
Right.
These women become bitter and resentful. They retreat from dating into a boss bitch career lifestyle, which for some women is right, but I would argue on average for most women is not what they necessarily want long term.
Right.
This big cohort of men here down the bottom, they become lonely and resentful, and they just retreat into porn and video games.
Yeah.
So it's
Unhealthy.
not really fantastic for anybody,
No.
and it's not even, I think, that fantastic for the the Andrew Tate Hustlers University crowd.
War room.
No, I don't think that it's great for them either because, do you really want in your 50s to still be slaying puss?
Yeah.
Is that really... And dude, this is this comes full circle for me as someone that lived that lifestyle, the nightlife thing, all of the values that I was told that society should, that I should care about, you know, the social renown and all the girls knowing your name and all this sort of stuff. Maybe for some guys that are more differently inclined than I am, that is the pinnacle of what they want.
Right.
But for me, it's not. Like, you know, I look forward to having a family. I can't wait to have kids. I can't wait to be a dad.
Yeah.
Like, I want to do that. That's part of my life path. And I don't want to have a family whilst, you know, sneaking out, even if it was with the allowance of my partner, to like go and fuck some like 25-year-old bird. Like, that's not what I want to do. Some people grow out of that, and evidently some people don't, or maybe some people kid themselves that they don't want to. But it's not good, man. Like, it's really, really concerning. And I think that trying to find a firm place for men to stand is really, really important. Raising men up without dragging women back is a very difficult situation to get ourselves into.
Well, especially given you said extremes on both sides. You know, as nobody's working together on this. It's
super
like,
adversarial.
It's a feminist, crazy feminist, and then the toxic masculinity.
Correct.
And so coming up with a solution is almost impossible with those two camps. I mean, how's it going to work?